It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. It's time for another house call with a good doctor. Dr. Andrew Nish is coming back on Podcast by George. We're going to be talking a couple of things here briefly about the COVID situation. I mean, we can't talk about medical issues without, talking about that briefly, but we also want to talk about a situation that I'm finding out a lot of people are unaware of, and it's the cancer risk in this part of the world, particularly here in the heartland, and radon. Now, I know you've heard about that, but I was kind of unaware about the significant risk that is posed by radon to all of us here in the central part of the United States, and we're going to talk about that briefly. But first of all, by way of introduction, Dr. Andrew Nish he's almost 3 decades on now as an interventional radiologist. His passion is educating the public and healthcare workers about true health and well-being and how this can be achieved through lifestyle changes, including food and nutrition, stress management, sleep, exercise, purpose in life, and the all-important social relationships. He's especially fascinated with the mind-body connection and how our thoughts and beliefs directly influence our physical and mental health. So let's get started here. Let's welcome him on in to another podcast by George. Dr. Nish, welcome.
Thanks, George.
Thanks for coming on in here. I'm going to bring this up on screen just by way of getting us started here. Now, this is, again, something that we've got to talk about. This is the coronavirus tracker. This is from the New York Times, and I've highlighted some things here that I find very significant and very troubling. Newly reported cases. This is over the last 90 days, this trend line that we're seeing here. And again, this is specific to Iowa. Cases, they're up. Now, this is a 14-day change. This is just in the last 2 weeks. They're up 16%. Total reported cases, 506,000 here in the Hawkeye State. Tests are also up 11%, so more people being exposed, believing they may have it. Hospitalized, and here's the thing, hospitalizations are up 5%. The only good news, certainly, is that the deaths are continuing to decline. So, Doc, let's talk about that first of all. A lot of people will, when you get together with friends and family, for instance, you can't hardly not talk about COVID-19. And what I hear a lot is, I'm sick of it. I'm done with it. I'm over COVID. But like you have said on this podcast, particularly here in Iowa, it doesn't appear to be done with us.
COVID's not over by any stretch of the imagination. And I think, we always we talked about herd immunity, right? 70-80% of people had to be exposed either through vaccine or the natural infection, and we'd be okay. I think most public health officials have kind of resigned themselves that, we're going to be dealing with COVID for a long time, just like we deal with the flu. It's not just going to magically go away. We are seeing, we've heard about the breakthrough infections. So people who have had 2 doses of the Moderna or Pfizer or the single dose of J&J are getting COVID. Okay. We know that the efficacy of these vaccines is waning over time. So, 5 to 6 months or more, we're seeing less efficacy of the vaccines, but the vaccines are still keeping the majority of people out of the hospital. It was really interesting, earlier this fall, August, September, most of our hospitalized patients were non-vaccinated, and that trend has decreased a little bit. We're seeing more vaccinated people in the hospital, not more than the unvaccinated. It's just that the percentage is going up a little bit. So, you and I were at an event yesterday together. There were several hundred people in a room. Both you and I had masks on, yet nobody else did. I still think that masks are an important public health measure, particularly knowing the fact that even if you're vaccinated, you can transmit the virus. Okay, that's I think a fact. It may be less time than if you're unvaccinated, but you can still transmit the virus. So that's why the public health messaging from the CDC changed earlier this fall, that even vaccinated people in a public situation with multiple people should mask. We need to still help and protect one another. We talked earlier, and the problem with all this is we have a vaccine. Okay, so the vaccine is our hammer, and if we have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So everything's about the vaccine, and we've lost the messaging of other things that we can do to prevent dying from COVID, and that is taking proper public health precautions. If you're in a situation with multiple people not within your sphere or pod, then we should be wearing masks again. I'm not saying we need to, close everything down. We just need to take sensible measures. Put on a mask. San Francisco, my daughter lives in San Francisco. They still all wear masks no matter where they are. They have one of the lowest infection rates in the country. Yes. So we have to be cognizant that COVID has not disappeared. It's still there. It's still causing significant morbidity in people, meaning they're being hospitalized or dying. And if we could simply just continue to wear masks in public settings, I think that could go a long way in helping, decrease the amount of infection. It also may decrease our, exposure to flu and other viruses that we see during the winter months.
Well, you were on it, and you were on it early, because people like me were saying, man, I can't wait to get my vaccine, because I get a vaccine, I'm going to go out in the real world again. I'm going to boogie. I'm going to resume business as usual. And you were saying on this podcast, no, these vaccines are intended to prevent severe illness and or death. And I think, like you say, the message has kind of been lost about the masks in particular, because I think if you want to keep from getting the coronavirus, the mask is your number one go-to weapon. I mean, the virus, the vaccines take over once you contract it, once you get the virus, to prevent this severe illness and, oh my God, perish the thought, death. The other part of it that I'm seeing a lot of from, and maybe you can comment on this, it's kind of from this anti-vax contingent, because they want to point to places that have high levels of vaccinations that are continuing to get infections. And what I say is, now maybe I'm not right in this, but it's what I'm talking about. If you get vaccinated as a population and say, whoopee, I don't need to wear a mask again, I'm going to go to large gatherings and groups and resume normal life, your infection rate is going to climb. And I think that's what's happening around the world.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, so we have, there's, this is, I'm reading a book right now. It's called Spillover. And it's about the transmission of infectious diseases from animals to humans. And, we look at things very simplistically. And I'm going to give you an example, Lyme disease. So Lyme disease is, always seems to be in the news. It's caused by a bacterium called Borrelia burgdorferi. And we thought it was a simple transmission from a deer tick who lives on deers to humans. It is not that simple. And so what we did is we eradicated deer in endemic areas. It started in Lyme, Connecticut. And they realized that Lyme disease infection wasn't going down. Well, that's because we didn't understand the life cycle of the actual organism. And it had little to do with deer, and it had everything to do with mice. And so by eradicating the deer population, we didn't change Lyme disease whatsoever. And so I think that, any infectious disease is not as simple as people want to make it. And there are multiple factors with the coronavirus that are causing increased infections. Number one, we have a Delta variant, which is more infectious, and we infect more people. Number two, we have a vaccine that was started 6 to 8 months ago, and we know that immunity is beginning to wane. So that's, people are maybe less immune. Number three, we're not taking it seriously anymore. We're not wearing masks. We're not social distancing. And I am absolutely no advocate for shutting anything down, but I am an advocate. If you're out in a public area and you don't know who you're going to run into and who's exposed or not exposed, just wear a mask, protect yourself, protect others. So there's just many, many things that are going on. And I think one of the other public health messages that gets lost and is really, really never talked about in this country is how sick our population is underlying all of this. We have 3/4 of our population that's overweight or obese. We know that overweight and obesity is a significant risk factor for severe COVID and death. And there was a really interesting article that I was pointed to the other day when I was reading something. And if you look at Ethiopia, So Ethiopia, African country, less than 2% of the population's been vaccinated. But if you look at their death rate and you equate it to, if you took their death rate and put it in our country and used all the numbers, we would only have 16,000 people that would have died from COVID. Their death rate is magnitudes lower than ours. And people are trying to say, why is that? Well, number one, they're a much more rural community, so they tend to congregate in tribes, rural. Those tribes don't necessarily mix very often because there's less inter-travel. But number two, and the thing that's particularly interesting for me is these people are pretty much metabolically normal. They're thin, they're active, they walk, they run, they do all kinds of stuff, and they don't get sick. And I think that, if we really want to capitalize on a public health messaging, and this is a very difficult thing to do, it's really, we need to recognize as a country and as a society how sick we truly are. Because if we have 3/4 of the population that are obese, then a majority of those people are metabolically abnormal. And we know being metabolically abnormal, meaning you have high blood fats and you have high sugars, and we know that being metabolically abnormal suppresses our immune system. So these cells, natural killer cells, which help us fight these viruses and things, are suppressed, and we don't do as well. So, there's just this perfect storm of stuff going on. And the other thing, you talked about anti-vaxxers or vaccine hesitant. There was a poll done and they looked at trust of industries, 25 industries in this country. You know what the 3 most distrusted entities in this country are?
Journalists, used car salesmen, and advertising representatives.
No. Big pharma, number 25, the least trusted of anything in this country. Number 2, the government. Number 3, public health.
Wow.
Talk about the perfect storm. Wow. And you wonder why we have hesitancy in vaccinations. I'm trying to understand that, and now I do understand it better. That we just haven't done a good job in this country. And this has been historical. People don't trust the FDA. And I think for legitimate reasons. I mean, we just approved an Alzheimer's drug by the FDA that was rejected by the advisory panel 11-0. How did that happen? So there's a lot of distrust out there, and there's distrust in the messaging. There's distrust in the government. There's distrust in the process of reviewing and accepting these things. And I think we have to recognize that those are really legitimate things.
Folks, we're talking to Dr. Andrew Nish, and one of the reasons I love having him on the show, he's so knowledgeable about so many different things. The big 3 on Podcast by George is climate, war, and healthcare, and they intersect. All of these things come together. The issues of the day, I mean, it all comes around to health in some way or another, it seems like. Doc, I got to ask you this question. You talked a little bit about the transmission from animals to humans. What about the reverse? I was really struck. It didn't get a lot of coverage. Do you know anything about, have you seen anything in the journals about the fact that in Iowa, 80% of the deer population, according to the DNR, has COVID? And it got it from humans. I mean, that's.
I'm going to plead ignorance. I have
that's
no
weird.
Idea.
Yeah, okay.
I haven't read that. I've seen nothing about that, so I can't comment on that.
I'll just put a graphic up on screen headlining that since I mentioned it, because that bears some further investigation. I thought that was.
Well, you have to remember, infectious diseases, whether they're bacterial or viral or protozoan or whatever they might be. They are adaptable to most any hosts. And, what's happened in our world, if you want to equate this with, climate change and what's going on our world, we as the human species are destroying a lot of the ecosystem in the world. And when we do that, these viruses and bacteria may have traditionally been infecting animals, but when we as humans displace those animals from their natural habitat, those viruses and bacteria are going to infect us, because they are not necessarily dedicated to a single host, but they will adapt to new hosts. And we can expect to see this more and more, I think, as we displace natural ecosystems with ourselves. Well, the bacteria, the viruses don't give a damn whether it's a human or an ape. We may get infected. So we have to, this is all truly interconnected.
Yeah.
This is all truly interconnected. And as we displace more ecosystems in this world, we're going to see more of this stuff.
Well, let me bring this up on screen now because I promoted this at the beginning. If we could talk all day, the good doctor and myself, about the COVID situation. We have before, but I wanted to get to this other thing, which I kind of learned a little bit about at this seminar that we attended, this gathering the doc mentioned, and it's about this situation with radon. And this article begins by Carrie Wignant, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but why are women who never smoke getting lung cancer? And it starts off, Lindy Campbell remembers the date, December 6th, 2017. That was when she found out she had lung cancer. I was so shocked, she says. She'd never smoked, and she didn't know anyone with lung cancer, let alone any other never smokers like her. That made her feel isolated. So there she is. So besides taking care of her own health, she set out to connect with other people who could relate. A year after her diagnosis, she founded Breath of Hope Kentucky, a nonprofit lung cancer advocacy and outreach group. Campbell is connected with more than 20 never smokers in or around the state of Kentucky. Folks, they know something about cancer, tobacco in Kentucky. But anyway, she noticed something unusual. Only one of those people is male. It's a small example of a pattern that's stumped scientists. Why are women much more likely than men to get lung cancer if they never smoked? And by the way, cigarette smoking is by far still the top cause of lung cancer. But about 15 to 20% of cases in the U.S. happen in never smokers, people who've never lit up or smoked fewer than 100 cigarettes in their life. In the U.S., women make up about 2/3 of lung cancer cases in never smokers, and that's unusual. Cancer is generally more common among men. In the past 5 years, there's been a lot of attention on why is this happening, and why are women disproportionately affected? Well, this goes on, Doc, and it talks about some of these particular causes, but there's some things that they're looking at in here, variants, hormones, and things in the environment like air pollution or radon. So, okay, that gets us to what I wanted to talk about here. Let me go back to the doc here. Radon, it's a known carcinogenic. It's an issue that's discussed worldwide, but I was surprised to find out that it's more of a risk and hazard right where we're at than maybe anywhere in the world.
Yeah, so let's just start with, we are seeing more lung cancer in non-smokers, women certainly more than men. And, we are trying to explain it. We don't have a good explanation. So let's look at risk factors for lung cancer. As you said, smoking is still the number one risk factor for lung cancer. Okay, it's not equivocal. There's no debate about it. Tobacco is number one. Number two is exposure to radon. So let's define what is radon. So radon is a natural breakdown product of uranium-238. So it's not a contaminant, it's not pollution, it's just a natural breakdown of uranium-238. It then seeps out of the soil as an invisible gas. And when you're outside, it's in such low quantity that it's of no risk whatsoever. The problem becomes is in our homes, radon can seep in through the foundations and collect in our homes and become a higher level of exposure. Iowa happens to be the number one state with the highest percentage of homes having abnormal radon levels in the entire country. We don't have the highest radon levels on average. That's actually in Alaska, but we have the highest percentage of homes that have abnormal radon levels, and that's about 72% of homes in Iowa, if you tested for radon, would be over EPA limits. The EPA limit for safety is 4 picocuries per liter. Okay. The average home in Iowa has a radon level of about 6.1 picocuries per liter. So why does radon cause lung cancer? Well, radon is radioactive. It rides on small dust particles, gets into the lower portions of our lungs, and it emits something called an alpha particle. The alpha particle then causes damage to the DNA, and that DNA damage over time can accumulate and result in lung cancers. So radon becomes a potentially preventable form of lung cancer in non-smokers. What I would advocate is that we should be testing for radon in all of our buildings in Iowa, because it's really radon mitigation is fairly simple. You vent this stuff out. It costs around $1,500 to $2,000. A radon test itself, you can get at the hardware store. We actually sell these radon tests at the hospital in our safety store for $8. So for $8, you get your radon kit, you hang it somewhere, usually in your basement. You hang it there for a week, 5 days, whatever it is, you send it in and they send you a value back. So it's very simple, it's very inexpensive, and we really should be testing all of our homes for radon.
And I was struck reading into this a little bit. Again, I talked about how it's so prevalent here, and Doc mentioned what it is, where it comes from. The glaciers moved across here, and it created this black gold. I had a farmer on here recently. We were doing a show about the UAW and deer strike, talking about how the Iowa soil is so valuable. Some of it just sold for $14,000 an acre up in northwest Iowa. I think they're setting records. But when those glaciers move across, they kind of ground up the rocks and stuff like that and created this bed, which is great black gold dirt for growing things, but it also has this bed of radon right under the state.
Yeah, I mean, we're a high rate of radon state, and we need to be cognizant of that. So that's one risk factor in never smokers. Another risk factor is secondhand smoke.
Yes.
So if you lived with a secondhand smoker for years and years, you have a slight increased risk of acquiring lung cancer. There are other environmental factors, asbestos, chromium exposure, arsenic exposure. And again, arsenic is a natural breakdown product in rocks. It can be found in wells, and all of our personal wells should be tested for arsenic, frankly. There's been some correlation with diet. They've shown that people who eat diets high in glycemic load, meaning rapidly digested carbohydrates that spike our blood sugar, may be at increased risk. Waist circumference has possibly been shown to be a correlate with increased risk for lung cancer. There may be a link with viruses, human papillomavirus. So we're looking at many, many different things. But it seems that biologically and epidemiologically, lung cancer in never smokers is a very different disease from lung cancer in smokers. So,
and the prospects, the hope, anyway, it's a little better, isn't it? I mean, the potential outcomes.
So when we look at, we are able to test for all these molecular markers in tumors. So we test for different markers, we test for different genetic alterations in the tumors, because we now have drugs that can be directed specifically at those to help us with treatment. So if you look at lung tumors, which are almost all what we call adenocarcinomas in non-smokers, a high percentage of those have actionable molecular markers that we have good drugs for. So people tend to have a little bit better prognosis with their cancer. The other part of that is non-smokers tend to be, frankly, healthier than smokers, right? Yeah. Their lungs are not as bad. Their smoking is a risk for heart disease. It's a risk for other cancers. It's a risk for stroke. So those people who don't smoke tend to be healthier in general than smokers. They tend to be more active. So lifelong inactivity has also been identified as a possible risk factor for lung cancer. And so you have a lot of things going for you if you never smoked, and you may have a better prognosis, with treatment. Yeah.
So my take on it is go to the hardware store, get a $20 radon detector, get your house mitigated for radon if necessary. It's not really cheap. The doc mentioned, it could cost you $1,000, maybe more. Yeah. But compared to the alternative, it's money well spent if you can find that kind of money to do something about it. And maybe thirdly, Doc, I don't know, particularly in this part of the country, get out of the house. Get outdoors, spend less time inside, which is what we have a tendency to do. Yeah. And maybe that plays a major role in this as well. Well, we're out of time. I appreciate you coming back on here. Another house call, as I mentioned. I always want to give you, maybe more than anybody else that appears on the show, a last word, Doc, because you can really put a bow on things. Wrap it up here for us on this edition.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about two different things. Number one, I would advocate that, you know what, if you're buying a new house, make sure it's radon tested. If you live in a pre-existing house, make sure it's radon tested and mitigate the radon if possible. You know, you can pay $1,500 for mitigation, or you can pay, you know, tens of thousands of dollars to treat your cancer. You know, it's a trade-off. And then the other thing about COVID is COVID is not done. We have a high transmission rate. It's highly prevalent in our community. So continue to take precautions, wear masks in public places, wear masks when you're around people who you don't know, and just be safe. We don't need to shut down. We don't need to not do things, but we need to be smart.
Folks, I hope you appreciate this. I know I do. Doc, thanks again for coming on another edition of Podcast by George.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
Yeah, and that's going to do it for this particular episode. Go to YouTube. You can see all the past editions of Podcast by George. We're also on Facebook in video. You want to watch the show, see the graphics, see the good doctor. And then if you just want to listen along, you can always get us on iTunes, Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, even Amazon Music carries Podcast by George. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.